Hey you! Tonight, we're peeling back the velvet curtain on an era where beauty wasn't just a standard, it was a sentence. Forget glowing skin and effortless charm. In the Middle Ages, looking beautiful meant looking fragile, silent, and just a little closer to the grave than to real life. Imagine this. You're in a stone room with no windows, just the scent of melting tallow candles and damp wool lingering in the air. In front of you, a warped, cloudy mirror. You're not admiring yourself, you're editing yourself. You're scraping, plucking, covering, binding, not to feel good, but to survive. Because in this world, the right cheekbone could mean a wedding, the wrong freckle, a whisper, a scandal, an exile. This isn't just history, it's a haunted house of standards we're still trapped in today. So before we descend fully into the shadows, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you're ready for more nights like this. Let me know where you're watching from. Your corner of the world might be warmer, but the ghosts of beauty past are everywhere. Now dim the lights, close the door, and settle in. They say the face is a mirror of the soul, but in medieval Europe, a woman's face was something far more perilous, a battlefield, a canvas upon which society, faith as in fear, each painted their expectations. Before a woman ever spoke a word, her appearance had already spoken for her, louder than any voice could. You weren't judged first for your wisdom, nor your kindness, nor your courage. You were judged by the curve of your cheek, the tone of your skin, the purity reflected in your gaze. And often, that judgment was final. Imagine a girl born into a modest household, her world confined to the smoke-dimmed kitchen, the creak of the loom, and the quiet prayers whispered at dawn. She doesn't know it yet, but her survival, her path in life, may be determined by how closely her features align with an invisible standard no one openly explains, but everyone enforces. The pressure is silent, suffocating. The shape of her nose, the placement of her eyes, the color of her hair, none of these are just biology. They're currency, their potential, their danger. This wasn't beauty as we understand it today, not self-expression, not personal confidence, not individuality. Medieval beauty was submission to a mold, and that mold came from above, from the church, from the aristocracy, from whispers passed between women over boiling pots and cloistered courtyards. A beautiful woman, they believed, was closer to the divine, but a too beautiful woman, that was temptation, that was threat. And so began the tightrope walk. Be admired, but not desired. Be lovely, but not lusted after. Show grace, but never pride. In every glance cast her way, a woman could feel the unspoken warning. One wrong step, and admiration could become accusation. Across abbeys and royal courts, down muddy village paths and bustling marketplaces, the ideal face began to form, not through celebration, but through constraint. High foreheads symbolized intelligence and nobility, so women plucked away their hairline until their brows sat awkwardly high on the dome of their skull. Thin lips reflected modesty, so any fullness had to be concealed, drawn smaller with tinted balms. Pale skin was a signal of wealth, a life away from the fields and sun, so women powdered themselves until their faces looked drained of blood. A healthy flush that suggested activity, labor, the outdoors, and nothing could be more unbecoming for a lady than looking like she worked with her hands. For those born into higher ranks, the pressure wasn't softer, It was sharper. A noblewoman's face was her family's banner. Her appearance wasn't her own to shape. It belonged to generations of alliances, to her father's ambition, her mother's maneuverings. A slightly crooked tooth or a ruddy complexion could ripple through political strategy like a stone tossed in a still pond. Marriages were arranged not just by land and lineage, but by symmetry and skin tone. Her face could open castle gates or close them forever. And beneath it all, beneath the rituals of grooming and silence and stillness, there was fear. Fear of standing out. Fear of being too plain, too bold, too noticeable. Fear of becoming the cautionary tale told by firelight, of becoming the girl who drew the wrong eyes or lacked the right ones. To be seen at all was to risk being scrutinized. And in a world where salvation and sin blurred into each other, scrutiny could be lethal. A woman in the Middle Ages was taught not to study herself in the mirror for too long. Vanity, after all, was a sin. But the paradox was cruel. If she ignored her appearance, she could lose everything. Yet if she cared too much, she invited judgment. The mirror was both a window and a trap, showing her the self society demanded, and reminding her how far she still was from achieving it. There was no satisfaction, only striving, no celebration, only correction. Behind closed doors, women shared tips and warnings, passing along recipes for skin whitening salves made from vinegar and lead, advice on how to soften a nose with carefully applied powders, rumors of which noblemen liked which features, all spoken in hushed tones like spells. They didn't own the rules, but they had to live by them. They couldn't shape the standard, but they had to suffer for it. And they did, generation after generation, face after face. There was no Instagram, no camera, no recorded memory of these women's laborious transformations. But if you walked into a medieval chapel and gazed upon the faces carved into the stone saints, you'd see the pattern emerge. The same face, the same curve of chin, the same cast of eyes. As if the artists were copying a dream none of them had ever truly seen. As if individuality itself had been erased from the very idea of what was holy or worthy. The danger wasn't just in failing to meet the standard. The danger was in believing you ever could, because the beauty ideal was always just out of reach, shimmering, shifting, adapting to each new generation's expectations. Women were chasing a mirage, and no matter how far they traveled, it only moved farther away. And yet they kept walking. They had no other choice. What began as a simple glance in the mirror had become a lifelong performance. And for every woman in medieval Europe, her face was the stage, the costume, and the story all at once. It wasn't just the face. The entire body, its curves, its posture, its gestures, was subject to inspection. To be a woman in the Middle Ages was to live inside a contested territory, a body that never truly belonged to you. It was dressed, judged, blessed, and blamed by others. It carried not just your soul, but the fears and fantasies of an entire culture. And that culture was obsessed with control. The church preached that the body was a vessel for the divine, but also a vessel of temptation. That contradiction was the root of endless agony. On one hand, a woman was told to care for her appearance, to honor God through grace, cleanliness, and modest charm. On the other, she was warned that too much attention to her physical self could lead to vanity, lust, and downfall. Beauty was a silent threat. A beautiful woman might be admired, yes, but also envied, desired, or accused. Too much of anything, too much curve, too much confidence, even too much health, could tip the balance from praise to punishment. And so, the body became a battleground. Women were trained, quite literally, to shrink themselves, to walk without swaying their hips, to sit without relaxing, to breathe without drawing attention. Their backs were kept straight, their shoulders low, their eyes downward. Posture wasn't just etiquette, it was morality in motion. The way a woman moved spoke volumes. Too much fluidity meant looseness of character. Too much grace meant seduction. Even the way she rested her hands could become a coded signal of decency, or lack thereof. Underneath layers of fabric, rules pulsed like nerves. The shape of a woman's waist, the angle of her neck, the swell of her chest, all were scrutinized. And since natural forms often didn't align with holy expectations, the solution was simple: bind, squeeze, conceal. Early corset-like garments weren't about support. They were about control, flattening, compressing, taming. A woman's natural form had to be reimagined to fit the standard, even if it meant difficulty breathing, bruised ribs, or restricted movement. But control didn't end with clothing. The church's grip extended deeper into the very way women perceived their own bodies. Flesh was suspicious. Appetite for food, for touch, even for rest, was frowned upon. The thinner, paler, more fragile you appeared, the closer you seemed to divinity. The ideal woman didn't just look delicate, she acted it. She ate little, spoke little, and tried to exist like a shadow, graceful but never assertive, a presence but not a force. Behind closed doors, this meant rituals of denial. Young girls learning not to complain when their garments chafed, when their stomachs growled, when their limbs ached from long hours kneeling in prayer. Mothers teaching daughters to endure, to smile through discomfort, to never speak of pain unless it served a moral lesson. Endurance became a feminine virtue, passed down like a family recipe, quiet, bitter, and essential. And yet, beneath all the suppression, desire remained. Not just romantic or physical desire, but the desire to be seen, to be valued, to be free. That's what made the standard so cruel. It dangled a kind of sacred approval in front of women and then shamed them for reaching out. The body, in its natural state, was never enough. But trying to improve it was dangerous too. The church preached humility, but the world demanded perfection. You could neither fully embrace nor fully reject your form. Women were caught in this impossible limbo, not saints, not sirens, but somewhere in between, punished for leaning too far in either direction. And the punishments were real, not always in dungeons or courtrooms, but in daily life, in the whispers of other women, in the judgment of men, in the quiet punishments of exclusion. A woman whose body didn't conform might find herself unmarried, isolated, or simply invisible. Art reinforced the myth. In paintings, sculptures, illuminated manuscripts, the female body appeared as an idealized silhouette, flawless and static. Real bodies with blemishes, bruises, scars, and stories were erased. Even depictions of saints were stripped of their humanity, shown with impossible smoothness, serenity, and poise. The message was clear. The ideal woman didn't just suffer in silence. She looked good doing it. And over time, women internalized that message. The pain wasn't just something they endured. It became part of the performance. A straight spine, a lowered gaze, a tightly bound waist. These weren't just signs of beauty. They were badges of control, both suffered and displayed. To be admired was to be endured, and the more effort it took to appear effortless, the more righteous the result. What made all of this more haunting was the way it was framed, not as oppression, but as honor. Women were told their bodies were sacred, and that sacredness came with sacrifice. If they struggled, it meant they were on the right path. If they suffered, they were being purified. The bruises, the hunger, the silence, it all had purpose, or so they were told. But beneath that surface, beneath the doctrine and discipline, the truth remained. The body wasn't just a temple, it was a prison. A perfectly decorated, deeply controlled, painfully beautiful prison. And there was more yet to come. The closer one looked, the more unreal the ideal became. It wasn't enough to appear modest, pale, and small. The true performance began in the face, the single most visible, most scrutinized part of a woman's body. And the terrifying truth was that the perfect face didn't even exist. Not in life, not in portraits, not in memory. It was a ghost, a composite of fantasies, rules, and fears stitched together from fragments of theology, court fashion, and medieval myth. And yet women chased it day after day with quiet desperation. The ideal face was an erasure, a high, expansive forehead, untouched by lines or thought, was believed to be a sign of intelligence and nobility. But no one was born with a brow that vast. So women plucked, scraped, and removed the hairline inch by inch until their foreheads stretched halfway across the scalp. The process was painful, but worse than the sting was the silence. There was no praise for this effort, only the absence of criticism. You were either acceptable or you were not. And the closer you came to this constructed vision, the less of yourself remained. Eyebrows, too, became casualties in the war against individuality. The fashion of the time demanded they disappear completely. A clean, unbroken expanse of pale skin was preferred to anything as unruly as natural brows. Where once expression lived, now there was only smoothness, deliberate, empty, and unsettling. A woman's emotions had to be controlled, even in the muscles of her face. No arches, no furrowed brows, no lines to hint at feeling, just serenity, or the performance of it. The lips had their own role to play. Fullness suggested indulgence, pleasure, hunger, all deeply suspect traits. Thin lips, barely tinted, were seen as markers of restraint. Any natural color had to be dulled with powders or covered entirely. The mouth became a line, a whisper, something that existed only to speak blessings, never desire, to smile too freely, to laugh too loudly. These were risks. A lively face hinted at a lively mind, and that was the last thing a patriarchal order wanted on display. Skin, the largest organ and the most visible canvas, bore the weight of impossible expectations. A perfect medieval complexion was described as alabaster, smooth, pale, untouched by sun or blemish. But life was not kind to skin, especially for women who worked, cooked over open flames, or bore children in drafty stone chambers. So they turned to remedies, some natural, some deeply toxic. Lead-based powders, arsenic-laced mixtures, crushed pearls, vinegar tinctures. The promise was purity, the cost was pain. Rashes, infections, even long-term illness were common, but silence was the price of appearing serene. To see a woman at her mirror, slowly transforming herself into a version of what society demanded was to witness quiet resistance disguised as submission. Each act of removal, each application of white powder, each careful line drawn across a lipless mouth, it all whispered the same question: am I enough now? And the answer always was almost. Almost, but not quite. Portraiture didn't help. Artists, working under noble patrons, painted what was expected, not what was true. Women's features were softened, their expressions dimmed. Faces became symmetrical masks, with no trace of the woman underneath. If a flaw existed in reality, a birthmark, a mole, a crooked tooth, it vanished on canvas. The result was a gallery of ghosts, each one nearly identical, none of them real. The living women who sat for these portraits vanished in oil and pigment, replaced by ideals more flattering and more forgettable. But perhaps the cruelest part was how deeply these standards were internalized. Over time, women began to police themselves. What started as external judgment became self-discipline. Mothers taught daughters how to pluck, scrape, and fade. Friends whispered critiques under the guise of care. Even in the quiet privacy of a monastery, nuns sometimes turned to natural bleaches, believing that outer purity reflected inner virtue. Faith and fashion blurred until they became indistinguishable, and as individuality faded, so too did memory. The stories of real women, their joys, their defiance, their imperfections, were erased alongside their eyebrows. History preserved their outlines, but not their faces. We know their names only when they were connected to power: queens, duchesses, saints. But even then, their images were so edited, so flattened by the brush of conformity, that we cannot picture who they truly were. To be beautiful in the Middle Ages was not to shine. It was to disappear just enough, to subtract, to erase, to blend into the backdrop of male history like a delicate watercolor that never dared to draw too bold. Women were expected to become the canvas, not the painter, and in becoming that canvas, they lost something no powder or plucking could restore. Because when a woman removes every feature that makes her unique, her brows, her hairline, her voice, her expression, what remains is not perfection, it's absence. And absence, no matter how flawlessly executed, can never be admired for long. Beneath the white powder and silent eyes, the true language of medieval beauty was suffering, and nothing spoke that language louder than the skin. Pale, drained, translucent, the kind of complexion that seemed more ghost than girl. This was not just a preference, it was a declaration, a symbol. To be pale was to be noble, to be untouched by labor, by sunlight, by the pulse of ordinary life. It was proof that you did not belong to the earth, but floated just above it, unreachable, untouchable, almost holy. But pale skin didn't come naturally to most women, especially not in a world where the sun was not a luxury, but a constant companion. Villages had no shade but trees, fields no roof but the sky. And so the struggle to appear pale, not simply light, but fragile, bloodless, otherworldly, became a ritual of transformation, and in many cases, of self-harm. The tools of that transformation were as ruthless as the expectation itself. Women turned to mixtures passed down in whispers, concoctions brewed in secrecy, and often in desperation. Vinegar mixed with chalk, powdered lead crushed into paste, mercury stirred with egg whites. These substances were applied day after day, layer upon layer, in the hope of fading freckles, concealing veins, erasing any trace of vitality from the cheeks. But they didn't just fade the skin, they poisoned it. Lead seeped into the blood, mercury clouded the lungs. Arsenic, used in some of the most effective mixtures, weakened the body over time, making the woman appear even more delicate. A tragic irony that only deepened the illusion of beauty. What society praised as elegance and grace was often the early symptom of illness. A trembling hand, a slow, soft voice, a fainting spell at court. These weren't just signs of frailty, they were signs that the standard was working. But why did women go so far? Why did they risk their health, even their lives, in pursuit of this look? The answer wasn't vanity, it was survival. In noble circles, to show any sign of physical strength was to hint at low birth, manual labor, or worse, unruliness. A flushed cheek or sun-darkened neck could ruin the first impression, close doors, end prospects. And in a society where a woman's value was often reduced to her appearance, first impressions were everything. Blood of warmth, a pale face could become a shield. It whispered of chastity, of innocence, of refinement. It implied distance, not just from the earth, but from temptation. The paler the skin, the cleaner the soul. At least that's what the church, the poets, and the painters wanted you to believe. In religious iconography, the Virgin Mary was almost always portrayed with pale, unmarked skin. Her image became the template for female virtue, pure, subdued, eternally calm. And so women were expected to mirror her, not only in behavior, but in appearance. A touch of pink, a breath of health, even that could be suspect. Color meant chaos, and chaos was never holy. Ironically, men were allowed to have color. A knight with a tanned face was seen as brave, worldly, tested. A working man's calloused hands spoke of strength. But a woman? The same marks of labor turned her into something less. Color robbed her of mystery, of worth. And so, layer by layer, women vanished, not behind veils, but behind chalk and poison and self-denial. They studied their reflection, not with admiration, but with calculation. Was the skin too flushed? Was the powder even? Had the blue veins around the eyes been covered enough? The goal was never beauty in the way we understand it today. It was distance. Disappearance, the illusion of untouched fragility. In castles and manors, among ladies in waiting and whispered gossip, there were those who pushed even further. Leeches applied to the cheeks to drain the blood, bloodletting to reduce internal heat and redness. Cool stones pressed against the face for hours. Anything to dim the fire inside and present a colder, cleaner shell to the world. The result was a kind of living contradiction. Women who looked like they were fading, even as they were in the prime of life. Bodies that had never been more alive, made to appear half departed. Beauty became a state of near vanishing, and that perhaps was the cruelest part, because the more effort a woman put into looking pure, the more her body broke beneath the weight of the lie. And when the poison finally settled in her bones, when her skin turned not just pale but gray, the world looked at her and said, how elegant, how refined. They didn't see the price. They didn't want to. Because to question the standard was to question the system. And in the Middle Ages, questioning the system could be even more dangerous than powdering your face with lead. And so the women endured, white as saints, silent as ghosts, alive but only just. If the face was a canvas, the hair was the flag, and in the medieval world, What you chose to display atop your head could say more about you than any spoken word. Hair, though made of something as simple as keratin, carried enormous symbolic weight. It spoke of class, of virtue, of power. It could attract or condemn, protect or expose. In an age where control of the female body was written into law and sermon alike, hair became one of its most politicized features. It was never just hair, it was a statement. From the earliest years, girls were taught that their hair was not fully their own. A child might run barefoot through the fields with loose braids and tangled curls, but that freedom had an expiration date. Puberty changed everything. The moment a girl crossed that invisible line into womanhood, her hair became a liability. Loose hair was considered dangerous, too alluring, too wild. It was associated with temptation, with disobedience, and even with sorcery. Letting it flow freely was a silent rebellion, and rebellion, no matter how subtle, had consequences. To be respectable meant to cover it. Veils, wimples, coifs, hoods, layers upon layers of fabric designed to hide what nature had given. For the upper class, this display of modesty wasn't optional, it was demanded. A married woman who went unveiled could be seen as provocative, unclean, or simply careless. All things a medieval society did not forgive easily. But more than modesty, the act of covering was about signaling belonging. You were part of the system. You knew your place. You were not a threat. Yet not all coverings were equal. Nobility wrapped their hair in embroidered silks, held in place by gold-threaded nets. Peasant women used simpler cloth, practical and coarse. Even in hiding, status found a way to show itself. The irony, of course, was that hair, the very thing meant to be suppressed, still dictated hierarchy. The more hidden it was, the more power it held in silence. But what lay beneath those veils told another story. Blonde hair, in particular, became an obsession. It was rare enough to seem mystical and was often linked with angelic purity. Paintings of saints and holy maidens often featured soft golden waves, even when the women being depicted likely had dark or coarse hair. As a result, women of all backgrounds turned to dangerous methods to lighten their natural color, from sun bleaching to applying urine, ash, and lye. Some even used saffron or crushed flowers, risking scalp burns and permanent damage, all to chase a color they were told meant virtue. Red hair, conversely, was burdened with suspicion. Associated with fiery tempers, moral ambiguity, or worse, foreignness, it was often hidden or dyed. Dark hair, though common, could also be problematic depending on how it was worn. Too sleek, and it was vain. Too thick, and it was wild. Too curly, and it invited all sorts of unspeakable associations. There was no winning, no safe middle ground. The ideal was specific, ever-changing, and impossible. Hairstyles themselves became coded messages. Certain braids were reserved for young girls, others for betrothed women, still others for widows or nuns. One misstep, one wrong pattern, and whispers would follow. A single exposed curl could start rumors. A misplaced ribbon could suggest impropriety. In court, in church, in village lanes, women were constantly being read and misread through what framed their face. For nuns, the message was even starker. Upon entering a convent, a woman's hair was often cut as a sign of devotion. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a stripping away of identity. Hair, after all, could attract. It could be admired. And admiration, in a system so heavily rooted in control, was always dangerous. To become holy was to become invisible, and to become invisible, you had to leave your body behind, piece by piece. Even in mourning, hair had rules. Widows were expected to tone down their appearance, often covering themselves more strictly, or even altering their hairstyle to reflect grief. Hair, once again, became an outward expression of inner life, or at least what society expected that life to look like. You didn't wear your sorrow on your sleeve, you wore it on your scalp. But perhaps the cruelest paradox was this: the most natural state, to let your hair down, to allow it to move with the wind or catch the light, was the one thing most women could never afford. To be natural was to be suspect. To be effortless was to be provocative. And so, hair became a labor, something to be tamed, managed, obscured. Every day began with the same questions. Is it too much? Is it too plain? Am I showing too little or too much? The burden wasn't just cultural, it was physical. Heavy head coverings in the summer heat, hours spent in painful braiding, dyes that scorched the scalp, oils that clogged the skin, all for the promise of fitting in, or at the very least, not being noticed the wrong way. And through it all, the message remained: your hair is not yours. It belongs to your station, your husband, your priest, your future. You may grow it, clean it, braid it, but you may never simply let it be, because in a world built on control, even a single strand out of place could unravel everything. Long before a woman uttered her first word, before she stepped into a room or met a stranger's eyes, her clothing had already introduced her. In the Middle Ages, garments did far more than cover the body. They declared its value. They measured virtue, modesty, wealth, fertility, even obedience. Every seam, every hemline, every cinched waist was a sentence in a silent conversation. And for women, that conversation was always weighted against them. Because in this world, clothing wasn't made for comfort, it was made for message. To be dressed properly was to exist within invisible but rigid lines. The body underneath was not to be celebrated or even acknowledged. It was to be reshaped, hidden, silenced. Clothes didn't just follow the body, they molded it. They pulled the waist tighter, narrowed the shoulders, lengthened the torso. Fashion didn't reflect a woman's natural form, it rejected it. The ideal silhouette was an illusion, and achieving it often meant real suffering. For noble women, this meant daily battle with fabric, layers of wool, linen, and silk, stitched tightly to the skin, pressing against ribs and hips, binding the chest. Early corset-like garments didn't always have the steel boning that would arrive in later centuries, but the principle was the same: containment. Breathing shallowly wasn't just a result, it became the posture of femininity, standing upright, stiff, elegant. To move too freely was to invite suspicion. Grace had to come with restraint. Femininity meant friction. The underlayers were stiff, scratchy. The outer garments weighed heavy. In winter, the cold bit through the seams. In summer, the heat suffocated. But the idea of adapting clothing to comfort was unthinkable. A woman wasn't supposed to feel good in her dress. She was supposed to feel shaped by it. The more effort it took to wear, the more respectable she appeared. Pain became proof of propriety. Even colors carried codes. Deep blues and rich reds were reserved for the elite, dyed with expensive pigments that cost more than most villagers would earn in months. Earth tones, unbleached fabrics, simple weaves. These marked the lower classes. But it wasn't just money that determined access. There were laws, literal, written laws, that dictated who could wear what. Sumptuary regulations forbade certain fabrics and colors for anyone beneath a noble rank. Fashion was not self-expression. It was social enforcement. And within those ranks, the stakes were even higher. Court fashion changed constantly, not to reflect creativity, but to test loyalty. If you arrived in last season's silhouette, you might as well have committed treason. You were out of step, out of touch, a woman whose usefulness had expired. Dresses grew tighter, sleeves longer, necklines narrower or wider, depending on who held the most influence. Following these changes wasn't just fashionable, it was political survival. And yet, the message was always the same. The body must be tamed. A loose garment was laziness. A baggy shape was indecency. A dress that allowed for easy movement, scandalous. Women learned to walk slowly, deliberately, not out of elegance, but necessity. Their clothing simply didn't allow for anything else. Every staircase, every doorway, every bow of the head was choreographed. And any failure to perform correctly, a stumble, a tear, a wrong color, could be interpreted as moral failure. Even the head and neck weren't spared. Rigid collars forced the chin upward, veils obscured vision. Gloves hid the hands, shoes pinched the toes. The more a woman was covered, the more invisible she became, but also, paradoxically, the more judged, because in being hidden, her worth had to be guessed, and the guesses were rarely generous. The irony was that men's clothing during the same period, while often elaborate, allowed far more freedom. Looser tunics, practical boots, belts that served a purpose. Men could ride, hunt, fight, speak loudly. Women, swaddled and restricted, were meant to glide, whisper, sit. Their clothing dictated their role, quiet, passive, still. But perhaps the deepest cruelty of this fashion was how early it began. Young girls, barely able to walk without tripping over their skirts, were taught to dress as small versions of the ideal woman. Their bodies were trained to endure discomfort before they even understood why. By adolescence, they had already learned the unspoken lesson. Beauty was pain, and pain endured silently was proof of worth. Mothers passed down these traditions with equal parts pride and pity. They sewed, pinned, laced, not to punish, but to prepare. They knew what the world demanded. They had lived through the same tight sleeves and bruised ribs. They taught their daughters not to complain, but to carry the weight, literally, of expectation. And while the garments changed across regions and centuries, the logic stayed the same. Shape mattered more than substance. Posture mattered more than comfort. Presentation mattered more than health. A woman who looked the part had done her duty, regardless of what it cost her behind the seams. This wasn't fashion. It was a uniform. And like any uniform, it came with rules, ranks, punishments. It wasn't designed to flatter the woman, but to reflect the values of the men who governed her world. The dress said, "I belong, I submit, I conform." And so, each morning, women dressed themselves not for themselves, but for survival. Stitch by stitch, they disappeared into the silhouettes that society demanded, beautiful on the outside, bruised just beneath. In a world where beauty was everything, aging was a slow erasure, not of the self, but of how the self was seen. A woman's worth in medieval society had always been tethered to her appearance. to the softness of her skin, the shine of her hair, the clarity of her youth. But time, relentless and indifferent, stripped these away, and with every new wrinkle, every gray strand, every shifting curve, society began to look through her, as though she were slowly turning to glass. The transformation was not loud or sudden. It didn't come with announcements or clear endings. It arrived quietly. One day, the glances lingered less. The invitations stopped arriving. The gossip moved around her, not through her. And the mirror, that once frightening tool she had worked so hard to master, began to reflect a stranger. Not because her features had betrayed her, but because the world no longer found them worth decoding. Aging for men was often seen as refinement. Gray hair signaled wisdom. Lines on the face meant experience. But for women, it meant decline, fertility fading, usefulness questioned, voice diminished, since a woman past her perceived prime was no longer the centerpiece. She was the backdrop, still present, but no longer acknowledged. This fading didn't just happen in courtly circles or noble halls. It happened in villages, churches, kitchens. The older woman became a fixture, a silhouette, someone expected to withdraw gracefully from attention. To be dignified meant to be quiet, to love the shadows, to accept invisibility as a kind of moral evolution. But not every woman disappeared willingly. There were those who fought against the retreat, who clawed for a few more years in the light. Some turned to the limited cosmetics of the time, mixing creams to soften the skin, using herbs to darken graying hair. Others leaned harder into piety, hoping that by adopting the look of the sacred, they could maintain relevance even as their youth left them. A few clung to fashion, dressing too young for their age, becoming whispers and warnings in the eyes of others. And then there were the accusations. An older woman who still desired attention, who dared to speak too boldly, wear color, laugh too loudly. She risked being marked, not as vain, but as dangerous. Aging and independence were a volatile combination. They unsettled the system. In the minds of many, beauty should fade, and with it, the woman herself. If it did not, if she resisted, then something unnatural was at work. The link between older women and superstition was no accident. A woman who no longer served the roles of maiden, mother, or bride became a mystery. And in the medieval mind, mystery easily turned to menace. She must be hiding something. She must have secrets, and secrets in a time of fear and faith were deadly. The older woman who stood too tall, knew too much, or simply refused to vanish could find herself labeled as something else entirely, a sorceress, a manipulator, a figure to be avoided. And so, many women turned inward. They accepted the slow disappearance, folded it into their lives. They became caretakers, advisors, watchers from the sidelines. Sometimes this brought peace, sometimes bitterness, because even as the body aged, the mind did not dull, the heart did not shrink. Desire for love, for purpose, for visibility remained, but it had nowhere to go. In rare cases, older women found power in their transformation. Matriarchs in noble families could wield quiet influence, hidden behind veils of tradition. Wise women in villages could become midwives, healers, guardians of knowledge. But these were exceptions. For most, the years brought a narrowing of space, a slow slide into silence. The tragedy wasn't just in the fading, it was in how complete the disappearance became. No more portraits, no more poems, no more mention. The same woman who had once been praised for her beauty, sculpted into statues, sung in verses, pursued in corridors, now existed only as a memory, and sometimes not even that. And yet, behind every quiet older woman walking the cloisters or sweeping the stones outside her home, there was a story, a fire, a name, a youth that had burned brightly, a mind that had known what it meant to be seen. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of the medieval ideal, that it taught women to mourn their own reflection long before life had finished with them. Because in this world, youth was never just a phase, it was a mask. And once it slipped, there was no stage left to stand on. In the medieval world, beauty wasn't a gift, it was currency, not metaphorically, but quite literally. A woman's appearance could buy her a better future, secure an alliance, elevate her family's standing, or if it failed to meet the invisible standard, it could leave her behind, untouched, unmarried, forgotten. Where men were judged by their land, their title, their sword, women were appraised like rare tapestries, examined, evaluated, and exchanged. Marriage was never just about love. It was a transaction, a contract, a power move between families, sealed with handshakes and dowries, and reinforced by the face of a girl barely old enough to understand her role in the bargain. The more beautiful the bride, the more valuable the deal. Not because beauty promised happiness, but because it promised influence. A stunning daughter could open doors her father never dreamed of. She could marry into wealth, inherit lands, bear heirs that would carry bloodlines further than war ever could. This wasn't hidden. It was taught. From childhood, daughters were raised not to lead, not to dream, not to question, but to be chosen, to sit still, speak softly, smile when asked. Mothers passed down more than recipes. They passed down strategy. How to hold your chin to appear more delicate, how to tilt your head in deference without looking weak, how to make your presence quiet but unforgettable. It wasn't grooming, it was training for display. Homes with daughters became quiet showrooms, and when the time came, those daughters were escorted one by one into the public eye, dressed in their finest, hair braided just so, skin powdered to perfection. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Their beauty did the talking, and the wealthier the family, the higher the pressure. If a noble girl failed to attract the right offer, her entire lineage suffered. A single marriage could make or break a dynasty. And so beauty became a kind of trap. Those who possessed it were watched, measured, and used. Those who lacked it were overlooked, dismissed, sometimes even pitied. A plain girl could be kind, intelligent, skilled, but that wasn't enough. Not in the halls of power, not where alliances were inked in flesh. The eyes of men skimmed past such girls as if they weren't even there. And what of the girls who resisted, the ones who looked in the mirror and saw more than potential value? They were warned, not with threats, but with silence. Doors that never opened, suitors that never came, futures that never unfolded. In time, even the most rebellious learned the truth. You could refuse the role, but the world would not write you a new one. Fathers, too, understood the stakes. They invested in their daughters' appearances as they might in a prized stallion or a fine suit of armor. The right fabric, the right jewelry, the right posture, all were calculated enhancements. Some even falsified their daughter's age or heritage to make her seem more desirable, Honesty was optional. Presentation was everything. And once the match was made, the beauty that had secured the contract became a kind of possession. Husbands paraded their wives like titles, proof of their power and taste. A beautiful wife could raise a man's standing. Her presence at court, her laughter at feasts, even the glances she received from others, all reflected back on him. But if her beauty faded, so did her influence. The currency expired. The contract, though sealed, lost its value. This commodification extended into art and literature. The ideal woman in tales and songs was always described by her features, her lips, her skin, her eyes. Her personality was secondary, if mentioned at all. She existed not to think or act, but to inspire desire and secure loyalty. Her beauty was both her purpose and her prison. Even religious life, which promised freedom from marriage, wasn't always a refuge. Convents accepted girls whose families couldn't afford a dowry or whose appearance limited their prospects. For them, the veil was not just a symbol of devotion, it was a quiet surrender, a closing of doors that had never been open. And still, girls dreamed. They dreamed of being seen, of being wanted, because they had been taught from birth that to be beautiful was to be loved, or at least to be valued, and value in their world meant survival. Behind every painted face, every tightened bodice, every polished smile, there lived a calculation, a weighing of chances, a hope that this day, this moment, this appearance might be the one that changed everything. Because in the medieval marketplace of power, beauty wasn't just admired, it was spent. And for many women, it was all they ever had. Somewhere between the glittering courts and the quiet farms, a myth began to grow. A softer lie, wrapped in the romance of the countryside. The idea that true beauty was natural, that away from the rigid rules of noble life, far from powders, poisons, and silks, there lived a kind of woman untouched by artifice. The peasant girl, the milkmaid, the barefoot muse with sun-kissed skin and wind-tangled hair. She was pure, wholesome, honest. She didn't need enhancement. She was beauty itself. But this image, beloved by poets and painters alike, was no more real than the powdered, corseted noblewoman she was meant to contrast. It was simply a different kind of performance, a fantasy projected onto women who had no voice in shaping it. In truth, the life of a rural woman was anything but gentle. The skin that inspired so many sonnets was burned, cracked, and calloused from labor. The hands that supposedly churned butter with delicate grace were swollen from hours of work. And yet, she too was expected to maintain a kind of effortless charm, to be strong enough to toil, but soft enough to appeal. It was a cruel paradox. Survive harsh reality, but appear untouched by it. Men from the upper classes often romanticized these women, painting them as symbols of unspoiled femininity. But they didn't see them. They saw ideas. They mistook exhaustion for elegance, silence for serenity. And when these women failed to match the imagined ideal, they were judged even more harshly, as crude, loud, too real, too human. In reality, village life came with its own set of beauty codes, less elaborate than those of the court, but no less punishing. A girl's hair might not be powdered, but it still had to be braided neatly. Her dress, though simple, needed to be clean, her apron unwrinkled, her gait modest. The local church, the town square, even the market path were stages of silent scrutiny. To appear too proud invited gossip. To appear careless invited judgment. And to appear attractive, whether intentionally or not, brought a different kind of danger altogether. She was watched constantly by neighbors, by relatives, by passing strangers. Every smile could be misread, every word weighed. Too much laughter, and she was flirtatious. Too little, and she was cold. Just like her wealthier counterparts, she lived in a world of impossible balances, one where her looks could either grant her a better match or mark her for unwanted attention. Even among the poor, beauty had its currency. A striking girl might catch the eye of a merchant, a landowner, a visiting noble, but rarely did this lead to protection or upward mobility. More often, it meant vulnerability. Being noticed in the wrong way by the wrong person could change a life overnight, and not for the better. And still, invisibility wasn't safe either. To be plain, overlooked, unwanted, that too was a sentence, though a quieter one. So women walked a narrow path, trying to embody a standard that no one had clearly defined but everyone enforced. Natural beauty, they were told, came without effort, but effort was always expected. Teeth scrubbed with ash, skin rubbed with sour milk, herbs chewed for fresh breath, hair braided just right, clothes mended with care. The myth of ease was propped up by labor, hidden, silent, constant. And what happened when a woman believed the myth? When she dared to step forward, unpainted, unshaped, unhidden, she was rarely rewarded. More often, she was corrected. A neighbor might offer unsolicited advice. A priest might preach about humility. A stranger might leer, because in the end, natural wasn't about being oneself. It was about conforming to a different expectation, one just as artificial, just as unreachable. Even literature betrayed them. Ballads spoke of simple girls who captured noble hearts, but the story always ended the same: transformation. She was dressed, adorned, made worthy. Her simplicity wasn't celebrated, it was overwritten. Natural beauty was only valued if it could be repackaged, and yet generation after generation, the myth endured, because it promised something easier, something gentler, a world without corsets or court etiquette, without paint or poison. But that world never truly existed. It was only ever a shadow, a dream dangled in front of women from every class, so that none could rest, so that all kept striving, all kept doubting, because the myth of natural beauty didn't set women free. It simply moved the goalpost, and no matter how hard they tried, whether in palace chambers or smoky kitchens, the finish line stayed just out of reach. Behind every flawless medieval face, beneath every veil of alabaster skin and curtain of golden hair, there was a secret. Sometimes it lived in a wooden box tucked beneath the bed. Sometimes it simmered in a pot over low heat, masked by the scent of herbs. And sometimes it lingered on the fingertips, a powder here, a salve there, each application a whispered plea, "Let me be enough." The pursuit of beauty in the Middle Ages was not gentle. It was cunning. It was raw. It was survival. And for women whose futures often hinged on how well they could perform that beauty, there was no shame in trickery, only necessity. When the standards were impossible, illusion became a skill, a weapon, a language spoken behind closed doors and drawn across the face with trembling hands. Cosmetics existed, but not in the way we think of them today. They weren't displayed on vanities or advertised in song. They were hidden, smuggled through custom, wrapped in discretion. because while society demanded that women appear effortlessly beautiful, it punished them for revealing the effort. Vanity was a sin, but failing to meet expectations, that was a sentence of its own. So the beauty rituals went underground. Lead-based powders, ghostly white and deathly smooth, were among the most popular tools. Applied daily to erase freckles, veins, and time, they gave the illusion of purity, even as they corroded the skin. Women knew the risks, the sores, the dizziness, the rot that came from wearing poison every day. But the alternative, to be seen in raw, unpainted truth, felt even more dangerous. For the lips, crushed flowers and berries created a faint blush, but nothing too red. Too much color could suggest desire. For the eyes, some women used belladonna to dilate their pupils, giving them a soft, luminous gaze. It blurred their vision, sometimes permanently, but it also made them look in the eyes of others, gentle, feminine, worth noticing. And then there were the fakes. Padding was sewn into dresses to enhance the shape of hips or soften the curve of the stomach. False hair, often taken from the heads of poorer women or even the dead, was braided into coiffures to add volume and length. Some women wore pieces of fabric or linen beneath their veils to simulate fuller hairlines or elevated foreheads. What looked like nobility was sometimes no more than clever stitching. For the teeth, ash and crushed bone were rubbed on the surface to simulate cleanliness. For the hands, lemon juice or vinegar bleached the skin. The pain was sharp, the dryness unbearable, but white hands meant wealth, and women were willing to bleed to prove they didn't labor. Herbal concoctions also played a role, often shared between women in whispers, handed down like treasure. Marjoram, sage, chamomile, lavender, not for scent alone, but for their supposed ability to smooth the skin, calm the nerves, or clear the mind. The line between medicine and makeup blurred. And so did the line between healing and harm. In some regions, women chewed the roots of certain plants to tint their lips or brighten their breath. Others used homemade tonics to reduce bloating or clear the complexion, many of them containing substances modern medicine would ban outright: mercury, lye, animal fat, even crushed insects. Nothing was too strange, too dangerous, too grotesque if it brought them closer to the phantom of perfection. Clothing, too, became a tool of illusion. Tight lacing could carve a waist where none existed. Strategic draping could hide a limp, a pregnancy, a scar. And always, beneath the fabric, something pinched, pulled, scraped, or burned. The dress didn't just enhance the body, it masked it, bent it, silenced it. There was ingenuity in these efforts, even brilliance, but no one applauded, because these tricks, these painful rituals, were meant to disappear. To look natural, to fool not just the world, but the women themselves, into believing that beauty was a birthright, not a performance, and the cost of getting caught was high. A woman too obviously made up might be ridiculed, or worse, accused, of vanity, of seduction, of witchcraft. The very tools she used to survive could be turned against her, so she moved carefully, like a stagehand behind the curtain, setting the scene but never stepping into it. There was no guidebook, no certainty, only trial, error, and silence. What worked for one might ruin another, and every success came with a shadow. What if they notice? What if it fails? What if, despite everything, Ingo, it still isn't enough? Because beneath all the layers of powder and paint, beneath the herbs and silk and flame-warmed salves, every woman knew the truth, that she was being watched, judged, and that perfection, even if achieved, would never be hers to keep. So she hid her tools. She wiped her fingers clean. She stepped into the lights, radiant, composed, unblemished, and no one ever saw the burn beneath the glow. She could be seen, but not heard. In portraits, she was serene. In poems, silent. In religious texts, she wept, served, obeyed the ideal medieval woman, whether saint or queen, maiden or martyr, did not argue, did not lead, did not raise her voice, and if a woman dared to question the beauty ideals forced upon her, she found no reflection in the stories around her, because those stories were never hers to shape. The authors of her world, painters, sculptors, monks, bards, were almost always men, and the women they created were not people, but symbols, chaste and graceful, meek and pale, eternally pleasing and eternally quiet. In their hands, womanhood became an image, polished, framed, repeated. It did not evolve. It was not allowed to. To deviate from the model was to become something else entirely. A villain, a temptress, a fool. Religious art offered no refuge. In the stained glass of cathedrals and the frescoes of cloisters, the female body was either holy or shameful. There was no middle ground. The virgin was pure not just in spirit, but in skin, in hair, in eyes. Her face bore no emotion but divine calm. Eve, by contrast, was dangerous, too naked, too curious, too human. Between them, all other women were forced to choose, and punished for choosing wrong. Literature followed the same script. The maiden in the tale was beautiful, obedient, and rescued. Her beauty brought her value. Her silence brought her reward. And when the story ended, she vanished, replaced by a happy ending she never got to narrate. If a female character spoke too much, knew too much, wanted too much, she became the warning. The bad example. She wasn't written to be understood. She was written to be avoided. The tragedy is not that women lacked a voice. It's that their voices were systematically overwritten. Their real faces, tired, determined, bruised, hopeful, were painted over. Their bodies, strong, aching, hungry, fertile, were dressed, compressed, erased. Their thoughts, their humor, their rebellion, all buried beneath the pages of men who called their stories truth. And in time, even the women began to believe the fiction. But fiction has a way of lingering, even centuries later, because the mirror that hung in a medieval lady's chamber did not vanish when her world collapsed. It changed shape. It slipped quietly into modernity, into the pages of magazines, into the glow of television, into the pixels of a filtered screen. And though the faces changed, the gaze remained. We are still chasing a version of that ideal today. Pale, thin, smooth, symmetrical. A body that is desired but never assertive. A face that is expressive but never aged. A woman who is visible but not loud, attractive but not threatening. Perfect but not real. Now it's no longer monks and painters who decide what beauty looks like. It's algorithms, studios, influencers. But the effect is the same, a narrowing of the possible. 1,000 faces trying to look like one. A silent race toward invisibility, wrapped in the illusion of choice. Plastic surgery offers what medieval powders once promised: transformation. Filters do what poisonous salves once attempted: perfection without flaw. Only now the tools are cleaner, faster, more accessible, and more insidious. Because the pressure no longer comes from a priest or a father. It comes from the self, from the feed, from the endless scroll of curated beauty, all whispering the same thing. Not yet, not quite, almost. But something is shifting. For the first time in centuries, women are beginning to tell their own stories again, to unearth the voices that were buried, to question the ideals instead of chasing them, to remember that beauty was never meant to be a cage and that the mirror was never meant to be a judge. New art shows wrinkles, new voices shout and sing and refuse to be reduced. Bodies of all shapes and shades take up space without apology. The script is being rewritten, slowly, unevenly, but with growing force. And this time, the authors are women. Not muses, not myths, but storytellers. The ghosts of the past still haunt us, yes. They linger in dressing rooms, in comment sections, in beauty ads, and childhood memories. But we are learning to see them, to name them, and in doing so, to weaken their grip. Because the most radical thing a woman can do today, just as it was then, is to be real, loud, visible, unfiltered, not because she wants to be admired, but because she finally understands that being seen is not the same as being known. And this time, she's choosing both.